In this video, we'll create a Visual Basic application that allows an end user to interact with the data in a SQL Server 2005 Express Edition database by binding that data to the user interface controls on our forms. So we'll briefly talk about data sets and the major classes of the system.data namespace, which is often referred to as ADO.NET. And we'll talk about how all the classes in that namespace work together to provide a friendly programming interface that you consume within your applications to make retrieving and modifying data very easy. Now, the star of this lesson is the visual tools, the windows and the wizards that we're going to see popping up that make integrating databases in your application a breeze. Microsoft made it really easy for those of us who are just getting started to create very rich data-centric applications. But they also expose the underlying classes and the code that supports this functionality so that experts can tweak it to their heart's desire. Okay, so first of all, what is data binding? Well, data binding is a feature of your user interface controls that allow them to retrieve information from a data source, like a database, and display that information to the end user. Now, each control might work a little bit differently here. Some controls will only display one value, or rather one field of data from a database. Other controls, like the data grid view, can display multiple fields of entire rows, multiple rows of data within its grid. And some controls allow you to edit the fields of data, which will then automatically update the original data source with those updated values. It really depends on what you're trying to do. And so we're going to look at a couple of controls in this lesson, and we're going to look at more whenever we create our RSS Reader application at the end of the series of lessons. We'll look at some other popular ones as well. Now, in order for all this to work, there's a series of classes in the .NET Framework class library that support this operation. Now, obviously, those classes that are directly related to the user interface controls, like text boxes and list boxes, they're going to be involved. But additionally, there are a set of classes in the system.data namespace that are referred to as ADO.NET. Now, ADO stands for Active Data Objects, and the name has ties to some previous versions of a data access programmer's interface from Microsoft years ago. I don't want to get bogged down in the etymology of ADO, but let's discuss all the things that ADO.NET does for you in an application, at least at a high level. And then later on in this lesson, I'll try to tie these concepts back to the concrete names of the classes, which will be created automatically for us as we drag and drop objects from the various windows onto our designer surface, and we're going to see how cool that is. Okay, so first of all, ADO.NET begins by managing the connection to the database, regardless of the type of database or other data source that you want to connect to. Now, a connection includes the process of locating the database, either using a file system or a network protocol, and it begins the handshaking to speak with the database. And just so you understand the concept of a connection, as long as a connection is open, your application can then speak to the database. Next, ADO.NET manages both the requests your application makes to retrieve the data from the database, and then it also manages the response from the database to return the requested data, or return a message that you asked for something that the database just can't deliver back to you. Next, ADO.NET then has a series of classes that manage the set of data that's returned back from the database query, so that you can write code to evaluate each field of data if you want to, or navigate through the data row by row if you want to, whatever you want to do. And then finally, at least for our purposes, there's a class that, for the sake of data binding the data to a user interface control, that this class will manage which row of data has been retrieved and set it to the current row. So if you have 10 rows of data your application returned from the database, all the user interface controls on your form need to know that they all need to be looking at the current row, for example, row 3. Now, if each control just looks at whichever row of data that they please to get their field of information, you've got problems. Each control on a form, in essence, needs to get on the same page, so to speak, so that all are looking at the respective fields that they need to display that belong to the same row of data. So there's a class that manages that current row of data and tells
the controls on the form that a new row of data is now the current row, and so you should update your values based on that. Now, as usual, I've greatly oversimplified this, but hopefully you can see and begin to appreciate at a high level that ADO.NET is doing quite a bit for you automatically. You don't really have to know the specifics of how it works under the hood in order to get some benefit from it. Just know that there's a lot going on to support you in the building of database applications. Next, you might be asking yourself, why build applications that provide access to a database? After all, in the previous lesson, I demonstrated how easy it was to just open up the database and add or remove rows right from there. So why not just let your end user have access to that instead of going through all the work of building this face on top of a database? Well, actually, that's a great question, and there's several reasons why you would want to do this. First of all, in order to really get a lot out of a database, there's a certain level of aptitude that the user has to possess in order to interact effectively with the data in the database. And when you create a friendly user interface, you're hopefully going to reduce the learning curve for the end user so that they can do their job without having to worry about this weird error message that came back, or having to worry about referential integrity, or having to worry about some complex query that is necessary to pull data from several different tables, and we didn't really talk about that yet. But there's actually a lot of functionality that you can encapsulate and make easier by virtue of the fact that you're building an application that resides on top of a database. So you may not want to give them access to it just to simplify their lives. And then secondly, perhaps there's data in the database that you want secure, so you want to ensure that only certain users or certain computers can access that data, or perhaps you want to log who is making what changes to what fields and so on, and that's why you need to kind of control it through the use of a user interface to have more programmatic control over who is doing what to the data. Or thirdly, in the case of a website, you may want to display data in a database like a product catalog for your company's goods. Now, in that case, you wouldn't simply just put the database directly on the internet. First of all, it's not very visual, and you wouldn't have the high impact that you want. But instead, you'd provide some web page template that can access the database and display the information in a templatized format to the end user. And then finally, in most cases, you don't want the users to directly access the database because, and there's really no easy way to say this nicely, but because they might screw it up. Your job is to make sure the data in the database is correct, that it's relevant, that it's properly formatted, and so on. And it would seem at times that your users are going to find every way possible to thwart your attempts to do this. So to restrict their access to the underlying data by making applications that do checks on the entry and the changing of the information can maintain the integrity of the data, making sure that it is correct, that it's well formed, that they haven't deleted things that they shouldn't have deleted, and so on. And honestly, there's probably a dozen other reasons why you'd want to create a user interface on top of a database instead of allowing the end user to access the database directly. And hopefully these are going to suffice for now. And let's get started with building an example or two. Hopefully it'll become more obvious as we move forward.
Okay, so I've taken the liberty of creating a new lesson called Lesson 09. And as you can see, I've already created a My Company database using the steps from the previous video. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that we have a Database Explorer with one table that I've created called Customer. I'm going to right-click and select Open Table Definition just so you can take a look at the columns that we've defined in this table. First of all, we have Customer ID, which is an integer. It's also the key, the primary key of our table. And we've also set the identity specification property of that field to yes. We also have a first name and a last name, both of which are varchar 50. So if you need to catch up right now, pause the video, create this table structure in a new project called Lesson 09, and then start it again whenever you're ready. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you're ready to move on. I'm going to close this down, and I'm going to right-click and select Show Table Data. And as you can see, I've also taken the liberty of entering a few customers. And at this point in time, pause the video and add some customer names to your version of the database. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you're ready to go on, and I'm just going to shut everything down here. And now what we need to do is create a new data source to our database so that we can use it within our application. So to do that, I'm going to select the data menu and then select add new data source. And when I do, I get the data source configuration wizard to pop up. Now this will let us grab data from not only a database but also a web service and a custom object that we might create. We're not going to demonstrate how to do either of these in this series of videos. We're going to stick with just pulling data from a database. I'm going to select the next button. Here it wants to know which database that we want to create a connection to. Now it will give us a list of those databases that are currently associated with our project. You can see here that we have the company.mdf, mycompany.mdf file selected. If our database was not associated at this time with our project, then we could select add a new connection. Also notice that I can expand this connection string, and we see a series of text here in what's called a connection string. And a connection string is just some information that the connection object of ADO.NET needs in order to connect and handshake with the database. We can't really do anything to this. We can't change anything about it. So we're just going to select the next button to go on. Here it asks if we want to save our connection string information, which we saw in the previous step, into an application configuration file. Now, an application configuration file allows us to save that information that might change and shouldn't be compiled into the executable, but rather in a text file or actually an XML file, so that it can be easily changed if we were to put this application on another computer. We wouldn't have to want to recompile the application every time somebody wants to install it in a new directory on their hard drive. Instead, you might just want to change what directory the database currently is in a text file. It's easy to change. So we're going to just go ahead and leave the default selections and the default name as is and click the next button. Now it's going to look through the database and find all the database objects that we can create a data source from. Right now we only have one table, so I'm going to select that and then click the Finish button. And the end result of this is that we're going to create what's called a data set within our application. After the data source configuration wizard finishes, you can see that a new file has been added to our project called mycompany.dataset.xsd. The .xsd file extension indicates that this is an XML schema document, and the purpose for this document, is to define the internal structure of the data set that ADO.NET will use internally to manage a copy of the data that's pulled from our database, so that it can work with that data in the computer's memory. So in other words, it can add records to the data set, it can delete records from the data set, it can modify records in the data set. Then once changes have been made to the in-memory copy of the data in the data set, the data will be copied back into or resolved back into the mycompany.mdf, which is a more permanent storage for the data. So don't worry if some of this didn't make sense. I think after this example you'll see exactly how the data set is used and how it works with the actual underlying data source, the mycompany.mdf, in order to create a working application. Now the neat thing that you can do in Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition is you can actually open this .xsd file and notice that it looks very much like the diagram view that we saw for SQL Server 2005 Express Edition. Also note that we have a table called Customer, and it has 3 columns: customer ID, first name, and last name. It also has some methods: fill, get data, and so on. And we'll use some of these whenever we're working with our in-memory copy of the data set later on in this video. But notice how that matches up directly with the fields that are in the actual database, the data store, mycompany.mdf, specifically the customer table. So there is a one-to-one correlation between our permanent data store and our temporary data store that we'll use only while our application is running. Once changes have been made to this temporary data store, the changes that are made will then be resolved back into the permanent data store, mycompany.mdf. So again, hopefully this will become a little more obvious what all this does in just a few moments here. But let's move on for now. The next thing that I want to do is I want to go back to my data menu, and this time I'm going to select Show Data Sources. And when I do, notice that it adds a new window called Data Sources into the IDE. And in this case, it's docked to the right-hand side. Depending on how your IDE is set up, it might be docked over to the other side. But you can see that we have then the My Company data set. So this is another representation of the data set. And we also have the customer table with our 3 fields: customer ID, first name, and last name. So let me do this. I'm going to open up my Form 1 by going back to the Solution Explorer and opening up my Form 1 into the main area, and then I'll go back to the Data Sources window, and I'm going to select from the drop-down box the name customer for the customer table, and notice that I get some selections here. I can select either Data Grid View or Details or None. So what does this mean? Well, this is an automatic mechanism that will do much of the work that we might want to do for our application in just one step. So I'm just going to select Data Grid View, and then I'm going to select Customer, I'm going to drag and drop it onto Form 1, and then it's going to start adding things onto the designer surface for my application. So let's take a look briefly at what's been added to our application. I'm going to move the windows over a little bit here. Notice that I get an instance of an object called the My Company Dataset. I also get a customer binding customer binding source, a customer table adapter, and a customer binding navigator. On the form itself, I get this toolbar, which has some navigation buttons, and then also a new delete and save button, and then a grid. Now, why do we get a grid? Again, because we selected the Data Grid View. We'll show the other one in just a moment, the Details view. So now all I need to do is run my application, and I have a fully operational application. You can see here that this looks analogous to what we saw with the SQL Server 2005 Express Edition tools, where I'm able to, at the very beginning of this, where I'm able to view the table data, and then I can move to the next row or the previous row. I can go to the first row or to the last row, or I can type in a number in order to go to that row. I can also select the Add New button in order to add a new row. I can select the Delete button to delete a row. And then, once I'm done making changes to the local copy of the data, see, all this data was pulled from our mycompany.mdf file, and it was placed in the local instance of our mycompany dataset object. So it's all stored in memory right now. But when I hit the Save Data button, all the changes will be propagated back to the original data store, the mycompany.mdf. So we have a fully functional application here. We didn't have to do anything in order to make this work. That's pretty cool. Let's do this now. Let's go ahead and select everything that was placed here one by one. I'm selecting them in the designer tray or the designer surface, then hitting the delete button on my keyboard. And now let's do this. Let's go back to the data source window, select the details view, and then drag and drop again onto the Forms Designer surface. And notice now that I get a different representation of the data. This time it's more of a details-oriented view where I'm looking at each record one by one. So let's run this application. And notice now that I'm looking at one record worth of data every time I go to the beginning or to the end. Now the other benefit is that I can still work with this application. So if I wanted to go back here and add some additional controls or modify the existing controls, I can make this read-only, for example, or I might want to add some validation to make sure that only numerical values are entered for the customer ID. I have full programmatic control at this point, which is a huge advantage. So while a lot was accomplished for us automatically, we still have control. It's just that the Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition data binding features allow us to get to this point very quickly, and then we can start making our modifications from here. So we have a complete working application right now, and this might be all the functionality we need. But since we're learning more about what is actually happening behind the scenes, let's take the time to look at all the items that were added to our designer tray one by one and find out a little bit about how they contribute to making this entire application. Okay, so the first item that we'll take a look at is the My Company dataset. Now we've already noted that what a dataset is, and that it's a in-memory storage area for the data that we're going to grab from the database. We make all of our changes to this My Company dataset, this in-memory version of the data, and then we can propagate those changes back to the original data source. Now, how did the data get from the database into our data set? Well, as soon as our form loads, it has to request that data be loaded, which brings us to the next item, which is the customer table adapter. The customer table adapter really does two things for us. First of all, it knows how to connect to a database. So it works with that connection string that we saw a little bit earlier in this video in order to handshake with the database. And then it has functionality within it that knows how to select data out of the database and put that data into the My Company dataset. It also knows how then to do the reverse, how to propagate any changes that were made while the data was being worked within the My Company dataset back into the database. So a table adapter knows how to retrieve data from a table, and then it knows how to put information back into a table. So, or it might know how to delete data from a table. But it knows how to communicate with the underlying database in order to make the changes identical to the changes that were made with the My Company dataset in memory. Now the next object is the customer binding source within our designer tray, and the customer binding source has the job of syncing up the data that's in the data set with the data that's currently being displayed on the form. So in this particular case, we need to make sure that all the fields, the customer ID field, the first name, and the last name field, are all pulling data from the exact same row of data within the data set. It wouldn't make sense if the customer ID was displaying record number 1, but displaying the first name and the last name from record number 2. Well, the customer binding source retrieves the request to move to a different record within the data set and then communicates that change needs to be made to all the fields that are currently bound or have a stake in the data that is retrieved from the data set. So you can think of this object as coordinating the data that's in the data set with the data that's in the fields. Finally, we see the customer binding navigator at the very bottom, and what that is a reference to this toolbar that exists to help us navigate through the various records and then also create a new record, delete a record, and then save the data back. So it communicates both with the customer binding source in order to tell the customer binding source that the user intends to move to the next record, the previous record, whatever the case might be, which then, as we know, communicates with the data set to actually display that data. It also then communicates with the customer table adapter whenever we're using the new, delete, or the save so that items are added, removed, or then propagated back into the original data source. So that's the purpose of the Customer Binding Navigator. And if we take a look in our toolbox, all of these items that we have just been looking at are actually items that we could have individually one by one dragged and dropped over from the toolbox and configured manually. So here you can see in this data section of the toolbox we have a data set, a data grid view which we just looked at a moment ago, the binding source and the binding navigator, and if we hunted around we probably could find the other ones that we've been using, for example, the customer table adapter. However, all these were added for us automatically through the use of the data sources window over here. We didn't have to do any configuration whatsoever. However, this really makes it seem like it's all extremely easy and there's nothing really to it, when in fact there's another player that we haven't looked at yet, and those are the properties that are associated with each of the text boxes in this case that bind a particular field of data from the data set to this particular control. So let's do this. I'm going to select last name, for example, and then go to the properties window, and you'll notice that next to the text property that there's a little database. If we scroll down farther to the data section, and let's move this over a little bit, you'll see that there's a data bindings rolled up property, and by going down to the text subproperty of data bindings, you can see here that it is bound currently to the customer binding source, the last name. So it is bound to the customer binding source. Why does it bind to the customer binding source? Well, remember that the customer binding source's job is to tell the field of data that's displayed to the user what the current record of data is set to within the My Company data set. So what we could do, for example, let's go down here back to that where we saw that, okay? And let's click this, and you can see that it pops open this little helper window that allows us to see what we're bound to. And we could change the binding here from last name to first name, or select some other data source by drilling down to a current list of data sources that are associated with our project. Now in this particular case, we don't have any. If we wanted to, though, we could select Add Project Data Source and add another one. So really you don't need to change anything from here yet. Whenever we work with our big project at the end of the series of lessons, you're going to see us use this extensively. So right now what I'll do is just click somewhere off of there so I don't make any changes. Okay, great. So my text is still set to customer binding source last name. And really for our purposes now, just understand that there are underlying properties that are associated with a particular field of data that's being pulled, being managed rather, by this customer binding source. Okay? So, up to this point, everything has been nicely done for us by this data sources window and by dragging and dropping this configurable data source item, this customer table in our data set, onto our designer surface, and then Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition does everything for us automatically. However, we could go about all these steps in a manual way, and so let's do that at this time. What I'm going to do is go to the Solution Explorer. I'm going to add a new Windows form, and I'm just going to leave it form2.vb. That's just fine. Now, why would you want to do anything manually when these tools do everything for you automatically so well? Well, there's going to be specific situations where the tools are not just going to represent the data the way that we want it to be represented. Right now, it's only been working with text boxes, but we may want to use other controls like combo boxes, radio buttons, and so forth. And so if we want that, we're going to have to take matters in our own hands in order to make those modifications. So we are going to have to know how to work with data binding in a more manual type of way, where we're taking more control in order to adjust the how the data is being displayed to the end user and so forth. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the toolbox, and I'm going to pin it down briefly here, and I'm going to find, first of all, a list box, drag it onto the designer surface, and I'm going to drag two text boxes onto the designer surface as well. And I think I'm also going to add a label so that I can kind of remember what I was trying to do here. So let's go to the properties and change the text here to a simple master detail example. Okay. So my intent here is going to be to display all of the customers here in the list box, or at least their last names, for example. And then by selecting one, being able to view their first name and their last name and possibly other information about them. Again, this is a very simple example. Here over in a more detail-oriented view where I can make modifications to the data and then save it back into the database. And so I want to do one more thing, I think, is add a button over here somewhere. Okay, so just to set some other things up here, let me do this. Let me put that there, and also what I want to do is go back to Form 1, and I need some way to open up Form 2 from Form 1. So I'm going to add a button, and we're going to need to learn this anyway whenever we're working on our RSS Reader application, and that's how to open one form from another form. So I'm going to double-click the button and write some code in here. Now, we know that a form is simply a class, so how would you go about creating a new instance of a form and displaying it on the screen? Well, you can do this in 2 lines of code. So let's do this. Let's go dim my form as new form 2, and then we'll do my form dot, and I happen to know that a form has a show method, and this is what makes it visible onto the screen. So let's go ahead and test this now. I'm going to save everything I've done up to this point. And I'm going to run the application. I'm going to click my button, and notice that it pops open my Form 2. So excellent. We're on the right track. Now we can get back to work on our Form 2. Okay, so the next order of business is to connect this up to the database. So what I can do is look through my toolbox and find, for example, a dataset object and drag and drop it, and then go through the steps of configuring it so that it actually pulls its schema, its definition, from this mycompany_dataset.xsd. Also, I could try and create a table adapter through the same steps. However, at the very top, you'll notice that since we've already worked with these items once, that there's already a strongly typed version of these components available to us at the very top. Now, what does strongly typed mean? Well, in this particular case, it just means that they were pre-configured for our use. So what we can simply do is just drag and drop them onto our designer surface, and we'll get all the functionality without having to go through the steps of configuring all of the properties for each one of these and then possibly making mistakes. So I strongly encourage you to use them if they're available to you. So I'm going to drag the My Company dataset, drag it in just somewhere on the blank area of the form, and notice that it creates a reference to it. And then I'm also going to do the same for the table adapter, and I'll save my application. Now let's do this. Let's run our application to see if this all just works. Okay, so we'll run our application. We'll click our button. However, nothing shows up in our list box or either of our text boxes, so obviously we haven't done quite enough at this point. So let's take a look at Form 1 to get some clues on what we may need to do in order to make all this work. And we'll quickly see that in the load event, the form load, that we have this 2 lines of code that are exactly the same. The reason that is because remember that step where we deleted off the data grid view and then we went to the details view? It just added the same line of code twice. So I'm going to delete one of these. But ultimately what's going on here is it's referencing our customer table adapter and calling the fill method, and then it passes in a reference to the mycompany_dataset.customer. So as the little to-do item up here says, this line of code loads data into the mycompany_dataset.customer table. says you can move or remove it as needed. Okay, so we're going to need to do something similar within our new form, Form 2. So I'm just going to copy this line of code. But before I paste it in, let's talk about this me keyword. The me keyword refers to the current class where you find the me keyword in. So in this particular case, me refers to public class Form 1. It's just a way of referencing other objects that are referenced within our more parent class. In this particular case, that's Form 1. So let's go over here now to Form 2. We'll double click somewhere here in this gray area, and then I'm going to paste in this, but notice that I don't get I get a blue squiggly line which says customer table adapter is not a member of lesson 09.form2. Why is that? Shouldn't it work here as well? We've kept everything named exactly the same. Well, actually, we didn't. Whenever we added in our company data set and customer table adapter from our toolbox, notice that it appended a little 1 on the name. So we're going to need to make sure that whenever it's referred to in code that we will be referencing the correct item. And notice when I make the change that the blue squiggly line goes away. So now we have the correct reference name to the instance of the object, the customer table adapter object that was added to our application. Okay, so in this particular case, we're calling the fill method of the table adapter. Remember what the purpose of the table adapter was? It's to communicate with the database and to grab information out of the database and put it into the data set. So we need to tell it which table of the data set that we want to store it in. In this particular case, it's the customer table of our instance of the data set, my company data set 1. Okay, so now let's go ahead and save that. The next thing that we need to do is to go over here to our designer view, and we need to connect our list box to our data set. So what I'll do is select the little arrow to access the quick tasks for our list box, and I'm going to select the Use Data Bound Items checkbox here. And when I do, it enables some additional items. So we'll need to select a data source, a data member, or display member rather, and a value member. So I'm going to click on the data source, and when I do, I get this little helper window that allows me to navigate for a data source either within my project or that's currently referenced on Form 2. I know that we've already got a data set that I want to bind to, so I'm going to select the My Company data set instance of the Form 2 object. Okay, and then I want to select a display member and a value member. So I'll just select last name for the display member, and for the value member, I'm going to select the customer ID. So what's the difference between the display member and the value member? The display member is what's actually what will be displayed to the end user on the form whenever they're viewing it on their computer. The value member is a hidden field that's associated with the display member. So for example, there might be more than one Smith, but a value member is expected to be unique. And we've already talked about the purpose of primary keys and using the purpose of an identity column within a database. Well, this is where the identity column will be used. Our customer ID will be unique, so by selecting one, our application will know which specific customer was selected by the end user. Okay? So let's go ahead and close this, save it, and then run it and see if it works. So I'll click the button here, and notice now that I have a list box that's populated with the last names of all the customers within my company.mdf. Okay? So let's move on to the next step. The next thing that I want to do is connect up the two text boxes so that whenever somebody selects one of the customers on the left-hand side, we can see the first and last name of that user, or that customer rather, over here on the right-hand side, thus the master detail view. Now there's two ways that we can go about this. One way is kind of a quick, easy, down and dirty solution, but there will be huge limitations. we'll be able to basically create a read-only scenario by using the current objects that we have available to us. In a more advanced scenario, we'll have to add an additional object to our designer tray, a binding source. But let's start with the easiest case first, and then we'll discuss why we need the binding source. So what we want to do is select one of the text boxes, and then I'm going to go down to the data binding section of the properties for that text box, specifically to the text property. And then here I want to drill down to the Form2 list instances to get to the data set reference, go to the customer table, and then select first name. And we'll do the same thing here as well, where we are going to adjust the properties for our second text box. Again, Form2, the My Company Dataset 1, customer, and then in this case, last name. Okay, so let's run this to see if it works. So we do have some limited functionality. Whenever I select an item on the left, there is a message that is sent to these text boxes that lets them know that they need to change their values to the current item within the data set. Now, if we wanted more extended functionality, we really need to rely on the component that was created for this purpose, and that is the binding source. So I'm going to shut this down, and I'm going to go to the data section within my toolbox and introduce a binding source by dragging it and dropping it onto my designer surface. I'm going to select it and then modify some of the properties of the binding source in my property window. So the first thing I want to do is select the data source. And the data source will be set to the instance of our data set. And then I want to change the data member and select the customer table. Now what I need to do is change the property that binds to the data set, and I want to change that to bind now to the binding source. So we'll go through that for each of these. First of all, I'll select here binding source 1. And then I'll make sure to select, for example, last name and then customer ID. So our list box is ready. Let's go to our text boxes. Here we'll drill down to our data bindings. We'll change this to our instance of our binding source and select our first name, and then we'll do the same for our last name. Okay, so we've changed the bindings for all three of our controls. Let's run our application to see if this works now. Now, admittedly, we haven't done much, and we've gotten back to basically the same point, but now we've set ourselves up for some advanced functionality that allows us, for example, to change Chuck to Charles, and then click our button to save that change back into the underlying database. So let me show you how we rely on the binding source to do exactly that. Okay, so to enable the functionality of saving changes back to the database, let's do this. Let's double-click our button 1, which gives us our button 1 click event, and we're going to need to take this in a couple of steps. The first step is that we need to get any changes that were made to the binding source and put those changes into the data set. So to do that, what I need to do is type some code, binding source 1.endEdit. Okay, so this will propagate any changes made into our data set. Now, our data set, our in-memory copy of the data, needs to be resolved back into the underlying database. Now, do you remember the object that we talked about earlier in this video that does that? You're right, it's the table adapter. So we'll do something like this. Customer table adapter 1 dot update. Okay, so we'll call the update method of our customer table adapter 1. And then you can see that this is overloaded. There's 5 different overloads for this particular method. We can pass in either a data table, a data set, a data row, or we can pass in each of the individual columns. So that's pretty neat. So what we'll wind up doing is using this first this first overloaded version of the method. So we'll do something like this. Let's see, what was the name of our data set again? I believe it was my company data set 1, and now we want to reference the specific table in that data set, customer. Okay, now notice that the update method also, let's just kind of get it back here where we're doing this. Notice that at the very end it returns an integer. And this integer, if we were to look at the help, tells us how many rows of data were affected by calling the update method. So we can tell if we actually were successful in making changes to the underlying database by making sure that that number is greater than 0. Okay, if there were 0 changes, then the update really didn't do its job. Something was dreadfully wrong. So what I'm going to do is create another variable here that I'm going to call rows affected as integer. And we're going to set that equal to 0. And then I'm going to set rows affected equal to our customer table adapter 1.update method call. Okay? So then what we'll do is give the user some feedback in a message box showing how many rows were affected. We'll convert that to a string so we can give some feedback. Now obviously we'd like to give a better message than just some number that pops open, but hopefully this will do for our purposes right now. So I'm going to go ahead and save everything and then run our application, and hopefully it'll all work. Click our little button here. And so we haven't lost any functionality. It seems that we're still able to navigate here on the left-hand side. But our end goal was to change Chuck to Charles and then select our button. And notice when we do that we get our message box with the number 1. One row was updated, was affected by calling the update method of our table adapter. So I'll go ahead, and the real test will be shutting down the application, because that change should have been propagated back to the underlying database, meaning that it's permanent storage. So even if we take our program out of memory and we restart our application, that whenever it retrieves the data from the database, that the change is actually made. So we have successfully added the ability manually to update the data that's changed within our IDE, and we've learned more about what each of these little objects that we saw added to our design surface automatically, how we were able to use these, and on our own, manually writing our own code to work with these objects in order to enable basically the exact same functionality. So in closing, let's briefly review all the things that we talked about in this lesson. First of all, we talked about the purpose of creating a new data source for our application. We noticed that whenever we finished the data source configuration wizard, that a new XSD was created. We looked at the XSD and noted that it defines the structure of a data set, which is used internally by ADO.NET to house a in-memory copy of the data that's retrieved from the underlying data source. In this particular case, our mycompany.mdf file, our SQL Server 2005 database. And then we were able to define data sources by going to the Show Data Sources option within the Data menu, and then by configuring the type of information that we want to display, dragging and dropping that onto our designer surface, and getting a lot of functionality for free. Notice that it created for us a data set. We talked about what a data set object is. We talked about the purpose of the table adapter, and that is to manage and negotiate the relation of data from the original data source into the data set and then back again. We talked about the purpose of the binding source, and that was to keep all the items that were being displayed on screen in sync with what the current record was in the data set. And then we demonstrated how to basically do all this on our own so that we could take control of the display of the data and then also write code that worked with the binding source and the customer table adapter to enable updating back into the original data source. Now we'll be using all these concepts whenever we create our RSS Reader application at the very end of the series of lessons, so stay tuned for that. I truly believe that this is some of the coolest functionality within Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition. It allows you to create some really powerful applications. And notice that even when we had to write code, how little code we actually had to write in order to accomplish some really cool functionality. So I hope you're enjoying this. Now if you enjoyed this video, please visit www.learnvisualstudio.net to download and watch over 400 videos just like this one, aimed at all skill levels on many different topics related to C#, Visual Basic.net, ASP.NET, and more. Thank you.